There is a specific kind of silence that settles over abandoned industrial sites. It is not the peaceful quiet of a forest or the empty stillness of a desert. It is a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind that feels like it is holding its breath. For nearly a century, these massive structures of brick and steel were deafening. They roared with the heat of 1,000 suns, consuming coal and iron ore, spitting out the foundation of modern cities. Thousands of men bled, sweated, and sometimes died within their walls. And then, one day, the fires were put out. The gates were locked. But there are those who believe that when a place absorbs that much raw human energy, that much agony and heat, it never truly powers down. The physical fires might be gone, but the echo of the furnace remains, burning just out of sight, waiting for someone to walk back into the dark. By the way, as we dive into this strange journey today, I am really curious about where you are tuning in from. Drop your city or country down in the comments. I always love seeing how far these stories travel around the world. Now, let us get into it. In the late fall of 2019, a 52-year-old man named Arthur found himself in desperate need of a quiet life. For almost 3 decades, Arthur had worked in high-stress logistics, managing freight shipments across the country. His days had been defined by ringing phones, shouting managers, and the endless ticking of the clock. After a mild health scare, his doctor had given him a strict ultimatum. He needed to eliminate stress or his heart was going to give out. Taking this advice seriously, Arthur cashed out a portion of his retirement savings and moved to the outskirts of Birmingham, Alabama. He wanted a job that required zero brain power and absolute solitude. When he saw an advertisement for a night watchman position at a preserved historical site on the edge of the city, it felt like fate. The site was an enormous, sprawling complex of blast furnaces that had been the beating heart of the local steel industry from 1882 until it was finally shut down in 1971. The city had preserved the colossal rusted pipes, towering smokestacks, and cavernous brick buildings as a sort of open-air museum. During the day, tourists would walk along designated pathways, taking pictures of the decaying industrial giant, but at night, the property was locked down, handed over to a single security guard whose only job was to walk the perimeter, ensure no teenagers jumped the fence, and occasionally shine a flashlight into the dark corners. Arthur was hired on the spot. His shift was simple. He would arrive at 9 p.m., settle into a small, climate-controlled security booth near the main gate, and conduct 3 patrols throughout the night. The first at 10:30 p.m., the second at 2:15 a.m., and the final sweep at 4:45 a.m. The rest of the time, he was free to read books, drink coffee, and enjoy the absolute silence. His first week was exactly what he had hoped for. The weather in Birmingham during November is usually crisp and cool, and Arthur found the night air refreshing. The furnace complex was intimidating at first. The structures loomed against the night sky like the skeleton of some prehistoric metal beast. Huge networks of catwalks zigzagged between massive, cylindrical towers. Shadows stretched and twisted in the beam of his heavy-duty flashlight. But Arthur was a practical man. He did not believe in ghosts. He did not care about the local legends that claimed the site was haunted by the workers who had perished in horrible industrial accidents decades ago. To him, it was just a pile of cold, rusting metal. The first sign that something was wrong did not happen during a patrol. It happened while Arthur was sitting comfortably inside his security booth on a Tuesday night. It was exactly 11:40 p.m. He had just finished his first round and was pouring himself a cup of coffee from his thermos. The booth was entirely enclosed, with thick glass windows looking out over the main courtyard. The air conditioning was humming quietly. Suddenly, Arthur caught a scent. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the aroma of his dark roast coffee, but within seconds it grew stronger. It was the sharp, acrid smell of burning sulfur and melting metal. Arthur frowned and sniffed the air. He checked the small space heater under his desk, thinking perhaps the wiring was burning out, but the heater was cool to the touch. He checked the coffee maker, the electrical outlets, and the small microwave. Nothing was burning. The smell was seeping in from outside. He stepped out of the booth, shining his flashlight into the courtyard. The air outside was cold, hovering around 45 degrees. There was no smoke. There were no strange lights. But the smell was incredibly potent now, hanging heavy in the damp night air. It smelled like a foundry in full operation. Arthur reasoned that perhaps the wind was carrying pollution from a modern factory miles away. He went back inside, closed the door tightly, and eventually the smell faded away. 3 nights later, the strange occurrences escalated. It was during his 2:15 a.m. patrol. The route took him deep into the center of the complex, down a narrow concrete path flanked by 2 towering blast furnaces known as Furnace Number 1 and Furnace Number 2. These were the oldest structures on the property, massive iron bellies wrapped in thick, rusted pipes. As Arthur walked between them, the gravel crunching softly under his boots, he suddenly stopped. The air around him had changed. Just a moment ago, he had been shivering in his heavy jacket. Now he felt a wave of oppressive, suffocating heat washing over him. It was not a subtle shift. It felt as if he had just stepped out of an air-conditioned room into the middle of a sweltering Alabama summer afternoon. Sweat immediately prickled along his forehead. He unzipped his jacket, confused. He walked forward 10 paces, and the temperature dropped back down to freezing. He took 10 paces backward, and the heat hit him again. It was a localized pocket of intense warmth, positioned directly in front of the access door to Furnace Number 1. Arthur approached the massive metal door. It was chained shut with a heavy padlock. He reached out with his bare hand and pressed his palm against the thick iron. He gasped and pulled his hand back instantly. The metal was not just warm, it was hot. It was so hot that it felt like it had been baking in the sun for hours, despite the fact that it was the middle of the night in late November. A deep sense of unease settled in Arthur's stomach. He stepped back from the furnace, shining his light up the side of the towering structure. Everything looked normal. There was no way the furnace could be hot. It had been gutted and empty for nearly 50 years. There was no fuel, no ignition source, nothing but rust and air. He convinced himself that it had to be some sort of bizarre thermal anomaly, maybe heat trapped deep underground in the old tunnel slowly radiating upward. It was a weak explanation, but it was the only one his logical mind could accept. He finished his patrol quickly, eager to get back to the bright lights of the security booth. The following week, the silence of the complex began to break. It started subtly. Arthur was on his 4:45 a.m. patrol, walking through the old cast shed, a massive open-air structure with a corrugated tin roof where the molten iron used to be poured into molds. The shed was notoriously drafty, and the wind often played tricks on the ears, whistling through the gaps in the metal. But what Arthur heard was not the wind. It was the distinct sound of a heavy metal hammer striking an anvil. Clang, a pause. Clang, another pause. Clang. Arthur froze, his hand instinctively dropping to the heavy-duty flashlight on his belt. The sound was coming from the far end of the shed, shrouded in absolute darkness. His first thought was trespassers. Thieves often tried to break into abandoned industrial sites to steal copper wiring or antique tools. He drew his flashlight, clicked it on, and swept the powerful beam across the length of the shed. The light illuminated rows of empty dirt trenches and rusted support columns. There was no one there. Arthur called out, his voice echoing loudly against the tin roof, warning that security was present and demanding whoever was there to leave the premises immediately. The clanging stopped. A heavy, oppressive silence rushed back in. Arthur stood perfectly still, listening for a full minute. There was nothing. Then, from the exact same spot at the end of the shed, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was the sound of footsteps, but they were not normal footsteps. They were heavy, dragging, metallic thuds, as if someone wearing boots made of solid lead was slowly walking across the dirt floor. Thud, drag, thud, drag. The footsteps were moving deliberately toward him. Arthur kept his flashlight trained on the source of the noise, but the beam cut through empty air. He could hear the heavy boots approaching, closing the distance from 100 feet to 80 feet to 50 feet, but there was absolutely nothing visible in the light. The logical part of his brain screamed that the acoustics of the shed were throwing the sound from somewhere else, maybe from the street outside. But his primal instincts told him he was in immediate danger. When the invisible footsteps sounded like they were less than 20 feet away, Arthur broke his own rules. He turned and walked briskly back the way he came, not stopping until he was locked securely inside his booth. He spent the rest of the night staring at the security monitors, his heart pounding in his chest. The monitors showed nothing but static and empty black and white pathways. He tried to rationalize it. He told himself it was just old pipes settling, animals in the brush, auditory hallucinations caused by fatigue. He needed this job. He needed the peace and quiet. He could not afford to let his imagination run wild and force him to quit. He resolved to push through it, but the sight was not going to let him ignore it. The climax of Arthur's time at the furnace came on the night of December 12th. The weather forecasters had predicted a severe winter storm, bringing heavy rain and unusually high winds to the Birmingham area. When Arthur arrived for his shift at 9 p.m., the sky was already a bruised, angry purple, and the wind was howling through the metal structures of the complex like a chorus of screaming voices. By midnight, the rain was coming down in horizontal sheets. Arthur was dreading his 2:15 a.m. patrol. He put on his heavy yellow raincoat, grabbed his flashlight, and stepped out into the storm. The wind nearly knocked him over. The rain lashed against his face, making it difficult to see more than 10 feet in front of him. The entire complex looked alien in the storm, the towering silhouettes of the furnaces flashing brightly every time lightning tore across the sky. He decided to take the shortest route possible, bypassing the outer perimeter and cutting straight through the central corridor between the blast furnaces. As he approached furnace number 1, he noticed something impossible. Through the blinding rain and the darkness, he could see a faint, flickering orange glow emanating from the seams of the massive iron structure. Arthur stopped dead in his tracks, wiping the rainwater from his eyes. He stared at the furnace. The glow was unmistakable. It looked exactly like the light of a massive fire burning deep within the belly of the metal beast. And then he felt the heat, even through the freezing rain and the howling wind. A wave of blistering, suffocating heat rolled over him. It was so intense that the rain falling directly on the metal of the furnace was instantly turning into steam, creating a thick, hissing cloud of white fog around the base of the structure. Arthur stood paralyzed, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. And then the sounds began. It was not just a hammer this time, it was the deafening, chaotic roar of a fully operational steel mill. He heard the screaming hiss of pressurized steam. He heard the thunderous crash of heavy machinery. And terrifyingly, he heard voices. Dozens of voices shouting over the roar of the equipment. They were not words he could understand, just desperate, strained yells of men engaged in brutal, back-breaking labor. The noise was so loud it physically hurt Arthur's ears. He clamped his hands over the sides of his head, dropping his flashlight into the mud. He squeezed his eyes shut, hoping that when he opened them, the hallucination would be over. But when he opened his eyes, the situation had escalated into pure nightmare. The heavy iron door of furnace number 1, the door that was padlocked shut with thick chains, was slowly grinding open. Arthur tried to command his legs to run, but his boots felt glued to the muddy ground. He watched in absolute terror as the door swung outward, revealing a blinding, roaring inferno of orange and yellow light. The heat radiating from the open door was physically agonizing, singeing the hair on Arthur's arms and making it difficult to draw breath. And then, something stepped out of the fire. It was the shape of a man, but it was massive, easily standing 7 feet tall. The entity did not have skin or clothing. Instead, its entire body appeared to be composed of molten slag and burning embers. It glowed with a sickening, shifting internal heat, its surface bubbling and dripping glowing droplets of liquid fire onto the wet ground where they hissed and violently extinguished. The entity had no face, just a featureless dome of burning ash. But Arthur could feel its gaze locking onto him. The heavy, dragging footsteps he had heard in the cash shed weeks ago returned, but this time he could see the source. The molten figure took a slow, heavy step forward. Thud. The ground seemed to shake. Arthur finally found his voice. He let out a raw, terrified scream and stumbled backward, tripping over his own dropped flashlight and falling hard into the icy mud. The entity did not rush. It moved with the slow, inevitable momentum of industrial machinery, taking another step out of the furnace and onto the gravel path. Panic flooded Arthur's veins. He scrambled to his feet, abandoning his flashlight, his pride, and his rationality. He turned and sprinted blindly into the storm. He did not care about the designated paths. He crashed through overgrown brush, scrambled over rusted pipes, and tore his raincoat on sharp pieces of discarded metal. The roar of the phantom furnace and the shouting voices echoed behind him, chasing him through the dark. He could feel the unnatural heat pressing against his back, convinced that at any moment a massive burning hand was going to grab his shoulder and drag him into the fire. He did not stop running until he slammed face first into the thick glass door of the security booth. He scrambled frantically for his keys, his hands shaking so violently he dropped them twice. He finally managed to unlock the door, throw himself inside, and slam it shut, locking the deadbolt and throwing his entire body weight against it. He collapsed onto the floor of the booth, gasping for air, clutching his chest. His heart was hammering so fast he thought he was going to have the heart attack he had moved here to avoid. He crawled over to the desk and reached for the landline telephone to call 911. He picked up the receiver and held it to his ear. There was no dial tone. Instead, coming through the speaker of the phone, he heard the faint, distinct sound of a heavy metal hammer striking an anvil. Clang, clang, clang. Arthur threw the phone across the room. He huddled under the desk, pulling his knees to his chest, and squeezed his eyes shut. He stayed in that exact position for 5 agonizing hours, listening to the storm rage outside, jumping at every creak of the booth. He prayed for the sun to come up. When dawn finally broke, painting the stormy sky in dull shades of gray, the terrible noises had stopped. The oppressive heat was gone. Arthur slowly stood up, every muscle in his body aching. He looked out the window. The furnace complex sat exactly as it always had, cold, dead, and rusting in the morning light. The door to furnace number 1 was securely closed and padlocked. There was no sign of fire, no sign of melted slag on the ground. Arthur did not bother gathering his things. He walked out of the booth, got into his car, and drove straight to the main office. He left his keys and his badge on the reception desk, told the manager he was quitting immediately for health reasons, and walked out. He never went back to the site. Arthur moved away from Birmingham shortly after, settling in a small, quiet town by the coast, far away from any heavy industry. But he never fully shook the memory of that night. He realized something profound and terrifying about the world. We build massive machines. We pour our sweat, our blood, and our lives into them to build the modern age. We think that when we flip the switch and turn the power off, the machine dies. But Energy does not just disappear. Sometimes the stone and the steel absorb the pain and the fire. Sometimes the places we build take on a life of their own, and long after the workers have gone home and the gates are locked, the furnace keeps burning in the dark, waiting for the next shift to begin.